Part 1, The Fire of Fear, Salem. Imagine a cold New England winter. The year is 1692, and the small Puritan village of Salem, Massachusetts, lies buried under snow and silence. Wooden houses sit close together beneath the gray sky, smoke curling from chimneys. Inside, people whisper prayers, clutching their Bibles tightly. This is not a time for laughter or freedom. Salem is a community built on fear, faith, and survival. The Puritans had come to America to escape what they saw as the corruption of the Old World. They dreamed of building a city upon a hill, a shining example of godly living. But life in the New World was harsh. The forests surrounding the town seemed endless and mysterious, home to native tribes, wolves, and, in the minds of many, the devil himself. Disease, famine, and isolation haunted them. And so, when tragedy or misfortune struck, people didn't ask why. They asked who among them had invited evil into their midst. That question would soon tear Salem apart. It began in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, the stern and ambitious minister of Salem village. In early 1692, his 9-year-old daughter Betty Parris and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began to act in strange and frightening ways. They screamed out of nowhere, fell to the ground in fits, barked like dogs, and complained of invisible pains stabbing their skin. They crawled under furniture, contorted their bodies, and shouted that unseen forces were tormenting them. No one could explain it. The local doctor, William Griggs, examined the girls. After finding no physical cause, he gave a chilling diagnosis: the girls were under an evil hand. In other words, bewitched. In a Puritan world, where Satan was believed to walk the earth seeking souls to devour, that word was enough to ignite terror. Soon, other young girls in the village began to show similar fits, and Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard. Within weeks, their screams echoed through the village. People began to whisper that witches were among them. Pressed by adults to name their tormentors, the girls began to speak. The first names they gave shocked the town. Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved woman from Barbados. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who muttered curses under her breath. And Sarah Osborne, a poor old woman who had defied Puritan norms by living with a man out of wedlock. All three women fit the Puritan image of sin and suspicion. They were outsiders, the kind of people easy to blame. Soon, the sheriff rode out to arrest them. The trials had begun. When the women were brought before the local magistrates, Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne, the atmosphere was electric. Dozens of villagers gathered to watch. The girls screamed and convulsed in the courtroom, claiming that invisible spirits were attacking them whenever the accused looked at them. The magistrates believed what they saw. Sarah Good denied everything, saying, "I am no witch." But when her small daughter, Dorothy Good, only 4 years old, was questioned, the terrified child mumbled strange answers that the judges twisted into a confession. Sarah Osborne was sick and frail, barely able to stand. She too denied the charges. But Tituba's confession sealed the fate of them all. Under intense questioning, and likely severe coercion, Tituba told the court that the devil had come to her. She described a world of black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and strange figures flying through the night. She said that witches had signed the devil's book, and that there were many more in Salem, maybe even dozens. Her story spread like wildfire. Fear turned into frenzy. If there were dozens of witches, anyone could be one. Within days, the number of accused began to grow. Neighbors accused neighbors. Servants accused their masters. Husbands and wives turned on each other. In a community already divided by old feuds and jealousies, the witch trials gave everyone a weapon. One of the most influential families, the Putnams, pushed many accusations forward, against people they had long disliked. Others, like Rebecca Nurse, a respected elderly woman known for her kindness and faith, were accused by those who once called her a friend. When her name was mentioned, many in Salem gasped. If Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then no one was safe. The village split in two. Some tried to defend the accused, urging reason. But most were swept up in panic, convinced that the devil was waging war on Salem itself. In May 1692, Massachusetts Governor William Phips established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to handle the growing crisis. The court's judges included powerful men like Chief Justice William Stoughton, who saw it as their sacred duty to root out witchcraft once and for all. The evidence allowed in court was shocking by modern standards. Most damning of all was spectral evidence, testimony that the accused person's spirit or specter had appeared to the victims in a dream or vision. If a girl screamed that she saw your ghost pinching her, that could be enough to condemn you. Imagine standing before a court, your life in the hands of frightened villagers, while young girls writhed on the floor, shouting that your invisible shape was stabbing them with pins. How could you prove your innocence? You couldn't. Between May and October of 1692, more than 200 people were accused. 19 men and women were executed by hanging, and one, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to plead. But that horror was still months away. In the spring of 1692, the terror was only beginning. The trials began in earnest in June. The first to face the gallows was Bridget Bishop, a woman known for her bright clothes and outspoken nature, both considered sinful by Puritan standards. She was found guilty and hanged on June 10. Witnesses said she maintained her innocence to the end. After Bridget's death, fear spread like wildfire through Essex County. Other towns began reporting witchcraft. Andover, Ipswich, Topsfield, all were swept into the hysteria. Each hanging made the next one easier. Each confession, often extracted under threat of death, fueled the fire further. People who confessed were usually spared execution, at least for a time. Those who refused to confess were sentenced to hang. The logic was cruel and circular: deny it, and you're lying; confess, and you prove that witchcraft is real. There was no escape. To understand Salem, we have to step into the Puritan mind. These were people who believed that every moment of their lives was watched by God, and by Satan. The world was not divided into shades of gray, but into light and darkness. Angels and demons. Salvation and damnation. Every sickness, every storm, every dead cow might be a sign of divine punishment or the devil's mischief. Their sermons were filled with fire and fear. Ministers like Cotton Mather warned that witches were real, that they had sold their souls to the devil for power. Books and pamphlets spread these beliefs throughout New England. And in isolated villages like Salem, such fears could easily turn to hysteria. The Puritans were also deeply superstitious. They believed that a witch could take the shape of an animal, cause illness with a glance, or send their spirit through walls. And when crops failed or children fell sick, someone had to be to blame. So when the young girls of Salem began to scream and convulse, the townsfolk didn't question the cause, they questioned who had cursed them. By midsummer, Salem was no longer a quiet farming community but a place haunted by suspicion. Jails filled with men, women, and even children accused of witchcraft. Chains clinked in dark cells where people waited for months to learn their fate. Ministers debated scripture. Families wept and prayed. Some tried to flee the village, only to be captured and brought back for trial. Others turned against their own kin, hoping to save themselves. Husbands accused wives. Daughters testified against mothers. And through it all, the afflicted girls continued their fits, screaming, falling, writhing, whenever the accused were brought before them. To the Puritans, this was proof that the devil was truly among them. But to us, looking back more than 3 centuries later, it's clear, something far more human was at work: fear, guilt, jealousy, and power. As the summer of 1692 deepened, the executions continued. Respected citizens like George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village, were dragged to the gallows. He recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something witches were believed unable to do, but the judges ignored it. He was hanged anyway. By August, the fields around Salem were littered with the dead, and yet the panic only grew. No one knew who would be next. And while the gallows claimed more lives, a quiet doubt began to grow in the hearts of some, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, something had gone terribly wrong. That whisper would soon become a roar. Part 2, The Trials of Innocence, Salem's Dark Summer. The summer sun of 1692 beat down on Salem, but it brought no warmth. The fields lay half-tended, the air heavy with fear. The gallows on Gallows Hill stood tall against the sky, a black silhouette visible for miles. People whispered that even the wind seemed to carry the cries of the condemned. By now, dozens were sitting in overcrowded jails, accused of witchcraft. Some had been locked up for months, chained in freezing cells, surviving on bread and water. The trials had taken on a life of their own, faster, crueler, and more unstoppable with each passing week. The ministers preached that God was cleansing his land. The judges believed they were instruments of divine justice. And the people were terrified. Each confession fueled the next. Once someone confessed, they were often pressured to name others, friends, family, neighbors, to repent fully. In this way, one accusation became 10. 10 became 50. And soon, over 200 people across Massachusetts were accused of serving the devil. Some of the accused broke under the pressure. Others stood firm in silence. The prisons of Ipswich, Boston, and Salem were filled with men and women waiting to die. Among them were people of all kinds, from the poor beggar Sarah Good, to Rebecca Nurse, a respected church member in her 70s, from Martha Carrier, who was accused of killing neighbors' cattle, to George Burroughs, a minister once loved by his congregation. The trials no longer targeted only the strange or the sinful. They had turned inward, toward the respected, the powerful, even the holy. That was when the people of Salem began to wonder, if ministers and elders could be witches, who was left to trust? In July 1692, the name Rebecca Nurse became the symbol of injustice. She was frail, 71 years old, known for her kindness and deep faith. Even those who despised the witch trials could not save her. When she was brought before the court, the girls screamed and convulsed, claiming her spirit was tormenting them. Neighbors testified that they'd heard her mumble strange words under her breath, prayers, perhaps, but in the climate of fear, every whisper sounded like a curse. The jury first found her not guilty. But when the courtroom erupted in chaos, the girls shrieking, the spectators gasping, the judges ordered the jury to reconsider. Under pressure, they changed their verdict to guilty. On July 19, Rebecca Nurse was hanged on Gallows Hill alongside 4 others. As the cart rolled away, her sister Mary Easty wept, knowing that her own arrest would soon follow. In that moment, something in Salem shifted. For many, the execution of a woman so pure was the first crack in the wall of hysteria. But the fear still ruled. What made the trials so unstoppable was a type of testimony now infamous in history, spectral evidence. The afflicted girls claimed they could see the spirits of witches tormenting them, choking them, stabbing them, appearing as shadowy doubles. And the judges believed that Satan could not take the shape of an innocent person. Therefore, if your spirit was seen hurting someone, you must be guilty. No proof, no witnesses, no logic, only the screams of children. This single rule turned every accusation into a death sentence. To deny the visions was to deny the existence of the devil, itself a heresy. And so the trials spiraled on, built upon dreams, illusions, and fear. In August, one accusation shocked the colony to its core. The afflicted girls named Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister now living on the Maine frontier. He was strong, educated, and respected, yet old grudges lingered. Some villagers whispered that he had beaten his wives, or failed to repay debts. Others simply envied his confidence. When the girls fell into fits at the mention of his name, Burroughs was arrested and dragged hundreds of miles back to Salem in chains. During his trial, the witnesses claimed impossible feats, that he could lift heavy muskets with one hand, that he had killed soldiers through witchcraft, that he was Satan's priest. He denied it all. But the girls screamed, claiming his ghost was biting them in the courtroom. The judges saw their pain as proof. On August 19, George Burroughs stood at the gallows. Before the crowd, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, a feat witches were believed unable to perform. Many gasped. Some began to doubt. But the execution went on. As the trapdoor fell, the crowd murmured in horror. One bystander, Cotton Mather, shouted that the devil could imitate piety to deceive the faithful. The hangings continued. By September, Salem's prisons were bursting. More than 100 people awaited trial. Among them was Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer. When asked to plead guilty or not guilty, Corey refused. He had seen what happened to others who stood before the court. He knew the verdict was already decided. Because he would not enter a plea, the court ordered an ancient punishment, pressing. He was taken to a field near the jail. Stones were laid upon his chest, one by one. More weight, he is said to have whispered. For 2 days, he endured the agony in silence. He never confessed, never cried for mercy. When he finally died, his tongue was forced from his mouth, the sheriff pressed it back with his cane. Giles Corey's death shocked the colony. To many, it was no longer justice, it was madness. Through September, the executions continued. Martha Corey, Giles's wife, was hanged soon after his death. So were Mary Easty, Alice Parker, and Puritan, and others whose only crime was defiance. By now, even the bravest citizens avoided speaking in public. Children went hungry because their parents were in prison. Crops rotted in the fields. Livestock wandered loose. The rhythm of life had collapsed. In nearby towns, people began to whisper that Salem had gone insane. But still, the court pressed on. Then, slowly, something began to change. A few judges started to question that spectral evidence. Could the devil really not take the shape of an innocent person? Was it possible that Satan could deceive the afflicted girls, making them see things that weren't real? Even Increase Mather, father of the influential preacher Cotton Mather, began to doubt. He wrote, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape, than that one innocent person should be condemned." It was a radical thought, one that would help bring the madness to an end. Meanwhile, Governor William Phipps, returning from the frontier war, was horrified to see his colony drowning in executions. He ordered the Court of Oyer and Terminer to suspend its proceedings. A new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, would take its place, forbidding the use of spectral evidence. It was too late for the 19 who had already died. The last executions took place in September 1692. 8 people went to the gallows that month, including Mary Easty, who left behind a letter begging the judges to stop the killings. Her words were quiet, sorrowful, and prophetic. "If it be possible, no more innocent blood be shed. I am clear of this sin before God." Her plea fell on deaf ears. The hangings continued until the very end of the month, when the public mood finally turned. Even the families of the accusers began to feel guilt. The afflicted girls grew silent. And the executions stopped. By October, the witch trials were collapsing under their own weight. But the damage, physical, emotional, and spiritual, would haunt Salem for generations. When the snow returned that winter, it covered more than the graves of the dead. It blanketed a community broken by suspicion. Many of the accusers recanted, saying they had been deceived or confused. The courts released the remaining prisoners, though many had lost everything: homes, families, reputations. Reverend Samuel Parris, whose household had started the hysteria, faced growing anger. His sermons now rang hollow. Eventually, he was forced to leave Salem, disgraced. The once obedient Puritan village now lived with an unbearable question. How could such evil come not from witches, but from within themselves? In the years that followed, silence fell over Salem. But guilt lingered. Families of the executed demanded justice. Ministers preached repentance. And those who had testified, the young girls, the judges, the ministers, carried the burden of their actions for the rest of their lives. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the main accusers, stood before her church and made a public confession. Through tears, she said, "It was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time. I desire to lie in the dust and be humbled for it." By then, Salem had changed forever. The world of superstition and fear that had once ruled Puritan life was fading, replaced by something new, a seed of reason. Out of that darkness would eventually grow a more skeptical, rational America, one that questioned authority, demanded evidence, and distrusted hysteria. But that would come later. For now, in 1692, the snow still fell on empty homes and silent graves. And Salem, the city upon a hill, was left to face the ghosts it had created. Part 3, The Legacy of Salem, Fear, Reason, and the Birth of American Conscience. The year is 1693. The prisons of Massachusetts have fallen quiet. The snow outside Salem village muffles every sound, as if the world itself wants to forget what happened here. But Salem will never truly forget. Dozens of innocent people were dead. Hundreds more were accused, humiliated, or ruined. And beneath the frozen ground, the victims of fear slept, not as witches, but as warnings. What began with a handful of frightened girls had ended in the destruction of an entire community. And yet, out of this darkness, something new began to emerge, an awakening. In early 1693, the new Superior Court of Judicature began reviewing the remaining witchcraft cases. Unlike the old court, it refused to accept spectral evidence. Dreams and visions would no longer decide life and death. Almost immediately, the witch trials collapsed. Governor William Phips issued pardons for most of the accused, and by May 1693, all who survived imprisonment were released. But many had lost everything, homes sold, children scattered, reputations destroyed. Some died of disease in prison even after being declared innocent. There were no reparations, no justice, only silence. The ministers, too, began to reflect. Cotton Mather, once the fiery defender of the trials, now spoke carefully, his voice filled with unease. His father, Increase Mather, openly condemned the use of spectral evidence and called for humility. The church, once the center of authority, had been shaken. The Puritan dream of a godly city upon a hill had cracked. And through that crack, a new light began to shine, the light of doubt, reason, and individual conscience. In the years that followed, the people of Salem tried to make sense of what they had done. The surviving families of the executed petitioned the government for justice. Some were given small sums of money, £600 total, a poor attempt at repair. Others received formal apologies. But no amount of money could erase the memory of the gallows. No apology could bring back Rebecca Nurse, George Burroughs, or Giles Corey. In 1702, the General Court of Massachusetts declared the trials a tragedy of error. And in 1711, it passed a bill clearing the names of those who had been condemned, officially restoring their honor. Even so, not everyone's name was included. Some remained guilty on paper for decades more. The people of Salem carried their guilt like a wound that never healed. Children grew up in the shadow of their parents' crimes. Ministers avoided the subject in sermons. And yet, deep down, everyone knew, it was not the devil who had visited Salem. It was fear. It was humanity itself. Years later, one of the original accusers, Ann Putnam Jr., the girl whose finger had pointed at so many, stood before her congregation in 1706. Now a woman of 27, she confessed her sins publicly. "I was deluded by Satan, and made an instrument of his hands in accusing innocent persons. It was a great delusion of the devil that deceived me in that sad time." Her words broke the silence that had haunted the village for over a decade. She asked forgiveness from the families of the dead, from the church, and from God. It was the first true act of courage Salem had seen since the trials began. By the early 1700s, the Puritan grip on New England was fading. The rigid theology that had ruled with fear began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The younger generation no longer saw the devil behind every storm. They were merchants, explorers, printers, men and women living in a changing world. The age of reason, or the Enlightenment, was dawning. Science began to challenge superstition. Philosophers like John Locke argued for reason, evidence, and natural rights. And across the Atlantic, in the colonies that would one day become the United States, people started to question all forms of absolute power, church, monarchy, and even tradition itself. The memory of Salem became part of that awakening. It served as a reminder of what happens when fear silences reason, when belief becomes tyranny. In many ways, the Salem witch trials were America's first great moral crisis. They exposed the danger of blind faith, the fragility of justice, and the power of mass hysteria. They forced the early colonists to ask hard questions. How should truth be proven? Who decides guilt? And what happens when the majority is wrong? These questions would echo through every chapter of American history, from the Revolution, to slavery, to McCarthyism, and beyond. Each time the nation faced fear, whether of witches, communists, or outsiders, the ghosts of Salem whispered, "Remember us." For centuries, the victims of Salem had no proper memorial. The site of the executions was left unmarked, almost deliberately forgotten. Only in the 20th century did historians and townspeople begin to restore their names to history. In 1992, exactly 300 years after the trials, the town of Salem dedicated a witch trials memorial, a quiet garden of granite benches, each engraved with the name of a victim and their final words. "I am innocent. God knows I am not guilty. More wait." These words still stand today, carved in stone, a warning to all who walk those paths. Tourists visit by the thousands, but for locals, the air around Gallows Hill is still heavy, a place where faith and fear once collided, and truth was buried beneath superstition. The Salem witch trials didn't happen in isolation. They were part of a broader human pattern, one that has repeated itself again and again across centuries and continents. The same forces that fueled Salem, fear, conformity, scapegoating, have appeared in every society under pressure. During the McCarthy era of the 1950s, when Americans were accused of being communists without proof, the phrase, witch hunt, returned to the national vocabulary. And even today, whenever society turns on itself in panic, Salem's name is invoked, a shorthand for hysteria and injustice. The tragedy of 1692 became a timeless lesson. The real danger isn't witchcraft. It's fear itself, and the ease with which fear can make ordinary people do terrible things. Ironically, out of that fear came one of America's greatest strengths, the insistence on individual rights and due process. The colonists who witnessed the madness of Salem began to see the need for legal protections, evidence, fair trials, and separation of church and state. These ideas would grow over the next century and help shape the U.S. Constitution. When the Founding Fathers wrote the First Amendment, guaranteeing freedom of religion and expression, the shadow of Salem was not far behind. They knew what happened when a government acted as both judge and priest. So, in a strange way, the victims of Salem helped build the moral foundation of the nation that rose after them. Their suffering taught America that truth must never depend on fear, that belief must never replace reason. Today, Salem is no longer a Puritan village. It's a bustling coastal city, a blend of history, tourism, and quiet reverence. Every October, the town fills with visitors dressed as witches, celebrating Halloween beneath banners that read, "Salem, the Witch City." Yet behind the festivities, there remains a solemn undercurrent, the knowledge that the real story wasn't about witches at all. It was about people, their faith, their fear, their frailty. At night, the streets of Salem glow with lantern light. Guides lead visitors past the old meeting house, the cemetery where the judges lie buried, the remnants of the gallows. And as they walk, they tell the story, your story, America's story, of a time when fear ruled and reason fell silent. If you listen closely, you can still hear them, the voices of the past. Not in screams, but in whispers. They remind us that the line between justice and persecution is thin, and that truth, once surrendered to fear, can destroy even the most faithful community. The Salem witch trials were not just a tale of superstition, they were a mirror held up to the human soul. A reminder that the capacity for good and evil lies in every heart. And that courage, the courage to doubt, to question, to stand against the crowd, is what keeps civilization alive. From the ashes of Salem rose an American belief that would echo through the centuries. That faith without compassion becomes cruelty. That law without reason becomes tyranny. And that fear, once unleashed, can consume even the most righteous people. But just as true, that redemption is always possible. That even after the darkest night, truth can find its way back into the light. 3 centuries later, Salem still speaks. Not through witches or spirits, but through history itself. Its lesson is not about the past, but about us. Because every time a society chooses fear over reason, suspicion over truth, or silence over courage, Salem lives again. The end. Thank you for traveling with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support is important to us.